Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is a rapid fire tutorial. I just finished it, so I wanted to come back and make sure that you knew this starts maybe a little bit slow, but then it picks up very quickly. So it's definitely not for beginners. If you are a beginner, literally just watch, and you might have to watch it a couple times to really start to comprehend or even start coding it. So with that said, let's jump in. Welcome to the REST API Basics tutorial. This single video is essentially an introduction to our more comprehensive course, but it's also an introduction to the Django REST framework if you're not that familiar with it, and we're going to be building a REST API. So check out the description below or right here on REST API Basics on our GitHub page for the REST API project to just get more context and information about what we're doing. Essentially, we're just going to be building a REST API. Now, the question you might have is why build a REST API in the first place? Now, this has to do with connecting your Django project to any third-party service or any client that you may build. So if you want to build an Android app, an iOS app, or an Angular app, you want to have your own REST API. And in this one, we're going to be skipping a lot of stuff and just jumping right in and building a REST API based off of a very simple Django project. And that's what's in this README here. I'll actually show you some of the simple things that you'll need to add into your Django project. So of course, I'm going to assume that you have some Django knowledge, and I'm also going to assume that you're sticking with Django 1.11. If you use a different version of Django, you probably will run into issues. So stick with Django 1.11 because it's going to be supported for at least the next 3 years. Okay, so and also the other software requirements too. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually jump into our project that we have already created. Now, the first thing to note, in our settings file, we've got our installed apps here, and we also have some REST framework related stuff. Again, that's more or less copying and pasting from that README file. The next thing is, inside of my postings app, I made a blog post model. Very, very simple model. You can just go ahead and pause the video now, copy this. I would say copy it exactly. You could also use that GitHub repository to copy it from there, especially by the time you're watching this. For those of you who haven't seen the on-delete related stuff, this is for future versions of Django. So if you had to upgrade your project or something like that, you're going to want to make sure that on-delete is there. What that means is simply when this instance is deleted, everything related to it is deleted. That's it. Okay. Or rather, the user instance, when that's deleted, everything related to that user instance in this blog post is also deleted. Check out the docs for more on that. Okay, so now that we've got this model, and I've already have it in my admin, and I also created, a super user. I ran my migrations. I did all these things that you should have an idea of already how to do. If you don't, check out our Try Django series. Okay, so now that I've got this out of the way, I want to start building my API. So inside of my app postings, I'm going to make a new folder in here, and I'm going to call it API. Really, this is a new Python module, so that means I need to make an init file in here to turn it into a Python module. Now, this API is for all of my API endpoints. So what do I mean by API endpoints? Well, let's go ahead and just make a little thing called notes.md, and it's going to be number one, a API endpoint, and that is for CRUD. So really CRUD related calls. So create, retrieve, update and delete. Those are the things that I want to do with my API endpoint or endpoints, right? So that also means that I'm going to want to be able to have the list and search view, right? So in many cases, as you may already know, this could be combined into one. And what we're actually going to do is say create list and search as one endpoint, and then retrieve, update, and delete as another endpoint. So as you also may be familiar, these have corresponding HTTP methods. Okay, so that's the other part of this is we have now HTTP methods. Let's just put this as another idea. And it's going to be get, post, put, patch, delete. Those are the methods that we're most concerned with. Okay, and they correlate to these API endpoints. And then finally, we have data types and validation. So the data type is going to be JSON. Validation will be a serializer. And actually, the data type is also a serializer. So essentially what we do is we create endpoints. Those are URIs is what they're called. So URI, which is also often referred to as your URL. But in this case, these are resources. We're trying to get some data. That's kind of a resource, right? So we want to get these endpoints. We want to develop these endpoints. Then we want to use these methods with our clients, right? So these are the client side. It could be a backend that's interacting with this, but these are HTTP methods that we will work with. And then finally, the data that's being passed around is going to be JSON, and then we're going to use some sort of like middleman to make sure that the data that's coming through and going out is consistent. And to make it consistent, we use a serializer. And then again, it's using these same sort of endpoints. So that's what we're going to be doing. That's how we're building this. Now, the reason I put an API module is to handle all of these endpoints related specifically to our API versus our entire Django project. Now, if you were just using Django as an API, if you were building a REST API just for Django, then sure, maybe you'd put it in the standard views file. Maybe you wouldn't. It's really up to you. I personally very much think it's better to put it in its own module within the app than to do it anywhere else. I think it just makes things nice and clean for us, which we'll see as we start building it. So how do we actually go about doing this? Now, let's go ahead and create some of these API endpoints in the way of views. So inside of this API module, we're going to go ahead and do views.py here. Now, just like the Django project, we have generic views. So generic views give us a bunch of convenient methods, right? They're just very, very convenient. If I know how to spell convenient, generic views just shortcuts everything for us. Okay, so what we need to do is import those generic views. Now, of course, with the documentation for the Django REST framework, we can actually see all of the generic views that are built in. So in the API guide, we go to generic views here, we click on this, and we can see all of the generic views, right? So we've got a create, list, retrieve, destroy, and update generic views. Those are all those CRUD methods that we want. As you also see is we have various ones that are just combined into one view. If you remember back to our notes that we just created, we wanted to put this as one. And what do you know? We've got one there. It's retrieve, update, destroy, and that is the API view that we actually want to go with. We want to use that API view. And if you want to get better understanding of where these things are coming from, we just know that it's a generics. So all the imports, the examples, they're at the very top of these docs. So we can just come in to our views and do from rest_framework import generics. And then we'll say class, and this is going to be our blog post. Let's call it the RUD view, missing the CRUD related stuff. And of course, it's just the retrieve, update, destroy API view. So it's generics.retrieve, update, destroy, and that's what it is. So with any detail view, so in the Django generic views, we've got a detail view, and what happens in that detail view. Now, number one, we've got a lookup, right? So a lookup field of some kind. So what field inside of our model are we looking up for? A lot of times you use the PK, which is AKA the ID, right? So it's an integer, right? So that is a field that's built in by default to our models. This should be well understood if you're watching this. So that means that our lookup field by default is the actual primary key. That is the default for the Django REST framework. It has nothing to do with Django at this point. Of course it has a lot to do with Django, but the setting itself is the Django REST framework. So we can change that if we wanted. So in some cases you might have it as the slug, or you might even have it as the ID. Now this makes a huge difference because when I bring this into my URLs, which I'll do in a moment, this is the actual regular expression that we're going to have to use, right? So in our case, we are going to go ahead and just say pk and d plus, something like this. This is that regular expression. And if you're using Django 2.0, this is where things could potentially break if you're not using URL regular expressions, just to keep that in mind. So we will actually come back to using that specifically. But of course, if I changed it to, let's say, ID, I would have to change that and change this. Just slight little things that we need to understand. The next thing is we want to say our query set. So the query set, of course, being related to our actual model. So let's go ahead and import that, and we'll do from postings.models import blog post. And the query set is blog post.objects.all. And of course, we can override this method by doing get query set, and we can return, you know, whatever we'd like here. So if we actually needed to change whatever our query set was, this is how we could do that. We would do it in this get query set method. And of course, since it's a retrieve view, you bet, we can also override the define get object method. And we can return some sort of blog post instance, right? So what this lookup field default is doing is it is getting the primary key from self.keyword.args.get pk, and then it would basically be doing get pk equals to pk. That's essentially what it is doing as a default when we have that lookup field. But if you declare this get object, it's going to override that and just completely ignore it, which we don't want. We're just going to go off of the built-in methods here to actually make this stuff work. Okay, so now we've kind of created one of the endpoints, right? So if we go back into our notes, we've actually created an endpoint. It's there. And those methods are built in, which we'll see in a minute. But something we haven't done is the data types and validations. Like, we haven't actually built that into our endpoint. Now, this is actually similar to how forms work. So we're going to go ahead and make a new file here, call it serializers.py. We'll do from rest_framework, import serializers, and we're going to go ahead and import from postings.models. We're going to import the blog post, and we'll say class blog post serializer. It takes in serializers.model serializer. Ooh, that looks a lot like forms.model form, doesn't it? There's a reason for that. Let's make sure we've got our colon here. And we'll do class meta, and model equals to the blog post and the fields that we want to declare for the serializer. I'm going to put all the fields in. So PK, otherwise known as ID, which you could put ID there. And then I'll go ahead and say user, and I'll say title, and I believe the last one was content, or actually the last one was timestamp. So let's just double check those fields. Just go ahead and copy that if you need. Paste it. We've got PK, that hidden field, user, title, content, timestamp. Okay, good. So we now have a way to serialize this data. Again, a serializer does two things. It converts to JSON and also validates, or validations for data passed. This part, of course, we still have to see. So now that I've got this, I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my view. So from .serializers, this relative import, we're going to import the blog post serializer. And much like when we have a create view or a form view inside of Django, we have to declare what the form class is. We have to do the same thing for this because it's a update and destroy API view. If it's just retrieve, well, actually, either way, we would have to have this serializer class because that it does two things. It converts it to JSON, so it allows that data to be in the right type, but it also validates the data. So the view is going to use it whether or not it's doing something like a form or create view does. Either way, it's used. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and create our own URLs file for this. So urls.py, I'm going to go ahead and do from.views, import that post RUD view, and I'm going to go ahead and copy my URLs from my main project just as a reference. Now again, notice the URL patterns, Django 2.0 users, this is not the same. And we're going to go ahead and put this in as a view here. I'll just get rid of the admin related stuff. And then of course it's not the home view, it's now the post-RUD view. And I'll call this post-RUD. And I still actually want to import it. So let's make sure I do that. And let's get rid of these notes. And there we go. So we actually have our API URL set up, at least for the detail view, with the exception, going back into our views, we talked about this lookup portion. So we definitely need to have that in here. So I just add that in. I'm just going to paste it in here. We just want, and it's like this. So we just want this regular expression right in front of that so we can see that in action. Okay, so we now have our blog post RUD view. This is a detail view, of course. So finally, what we have to do is add in this to our URLs. So we have to make sure that we're importing the include method here. And I'm going to go ahead and do URL r hat, and it's going to be API postings. And then we're going to leave it open-ended. So we have those other URLs and we say include, and this is postings.api.urls. And we're going to add in the namespace of API-postings and put a comma at the end. Now that we've saved that, again, you want to make sure all your migrations are done. And we're going to go into our admin here. And I'm going to create an actual blog post. And I'll give it to my user. And we'll say blah post. Doesn't really matter. Hit save and continue. Oh, I got a Unicode error. Oops. We want to go ahead and do the string of user.username. Sorry about that little mistake. I hit that. Okay, good. Now I've got an ID of 1 for this actual item. We go into our API to take a look at it. Postings 1, and what do you know? There is our data. It's in JSON, and we can do several different methods on here. So I'm going to take a break for a moment. I recommend that you do as well. When we come back, we're going to kind of finish all this stuff off. But as you see, we've already done a lot of stuff in building an API in the last, 17 minutes or so. It definitely went really, really fast. I totally get that. But the point is to show you how quickly you can get an API up and running. And the reason I'm saying, hey, take a break, go ahead and play around with this data now. Add some new blog posts. Do that sort of stuff. Just pause the video because that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pause the recording and then I'll come back and finish this stuff off. So see you in a few moments. Hopefully you pause the video now. So hopefully you paused and add some blog posts on there and possibly even played around with this console. This is the API console that's built into the Django REST framework. But as we've noticed, we can see there's this delete option. I can do put or patch here. I can even use the HTML form that they have. So there's a lot of different ways on how I can go about manipulating or working with this data. Before I move any further, what I will say though is inside of my view, if I change this to, let's say, for instance, just our retrieve API view and saved that, refreshed in here, all of those options go away. And also if I changed it to, let's say, retrieve update API view, only a few options come back, as in put or patch. And we see that the HTTP methods that are allowed are there. So again, we're leaving that RUD sort of methods in there so we can do everything we need to do to this specific item. Now, some things that are kind of cool about this, what if I change this PK to being like 5, and then I change the content saying changed PK, and I hit put? Well, I actually can't write the PK. So that's an example of a read-only field, right? So inside of my serializer, I can actually set read-only fields. So read-only fields, and I can set them how I'd like. So PK is one of them. I could also set user as a read-only field. So if I refresh back in here, obviously if I change this number to, let's say, 2 and hit put, it doesn't do anything. Now, if I didn't have that as a read-only field, let's see what happens. I do user2, I hit put. I say this user, well, PK invalid primary key. So it's actually saying the user invalid primary key of 2 object does not exist. Well, what's that error that we see? If we look on our user, I only have one user in here, so that doesn't make any sense. So read-only fields are really nice for when we're trying to manipulate the data. But the nice thing about this too is that when I did try to change this user and hit put, of course it doesn't actually do anything, right? But if I wanted to validate the content further or any one of our fields, I can do that inside of the serializer. So much like we have in our forms, we have a clean field name method. We can do the same sort of idea, but instead of clean, it's validate and the field name, or validate the entire thing. But I'm just going to do validate title, and we'll say self and the actual value. So the actual value is passed here, so we can actually, come in and make sure that this value is, let's say, for instance, we want it to be unique. So I would just basically say QS equals to blogpost.objects.i or filter, and we'll say title __ I exact equals to value. And we'll just say if QS.exists, then we'll do raise serializers.validation error. And we're going to say the title must be unique. Otherwise, we'll just return back that value. Okay, so we save that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and try and make this value the same as a different post. So let's go into my posts and just take a look. I've got post 2 here. So this is the single one. I'm going to call it post 2. I'll hit put, and I'll say title must be unique. I tried again. It gives me that same title must be unique, even with post. So this is actually not the greatest because it's filtering based off of the actual object itself. Like it's including the current instance. So we actually need to exclude that current instance. And to do that, we'll just say if self.instance. So if it even exists, then we'll say QS equals to QS.exclude, and PK equals to instant or self.instance.pk. We save that. We go back in here and hit put. Notice it doesn't give me that error now. So if I hit put a few times, it doesn't. And then if I change it to post 2, again, the title must be unique. So of course, I would probably not say the title must be unique. I'd probably say the title or this title has already been used. Right? Very simple way of doing validation on this. Now, of course, this is just the one single model serializer. So what I need to do now is actually create a view to create. So we need the create view as well as the list view. But first, what I'm going to do is just the create view. I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here, and I'll just call this the blog post API view. And instead of all the retrieve, update, destroy, I'm just going to try create API view. And I'll leave that get query set in there, and also the query set or the serializer class that we have. I'm going to go ahead and import this into my views, and then I'm going to grab this right here and paste that in just like that. And of course, get rid of that primary key related stuff. We don't need that. And now I'm going to call this post create. And now let's go ahead and go to that endpoint. I'm now where I can create it. Notice it says detail method get is not allowed. I can go to my HTML form. I can actually create some data here. Notice the two things that are coming through. User is not one of them, right? So user is a read-only field. So let's go ahead and try and create one. I'll say new item, and I'll give it some random content, and I'll hit post. I get an error, not null constraint. The user is required. So this is one of those things where it will require authentication. Now, a very easy way to do this is say define perform create, and it takes in self and serializer, like the actual serializer that's being passed. And then we'll just go ahead and say serializer, oops, dot save user equals to self.request.user. We'll verify this stuff in just a moment, but let's go ahead and go back in here and let's create our user, or create our new content. So new content, and I'll just say ABC. I hit post now, and what do you know? New content is actually coming through. So we now have a way to create, retrieve, update, and delete. We have all of CRUD. One example that we don't have is the list API view. So I'm actually going to call this the list API view, and we'll refresh back in here. And now we've got our postings, and we've got the 4 items that we have created, right? So our most recent one is here, and then a few others we did off of the video. So how do I actually combine that create method inside of here? I did mention that we are going to have it where it's those 2 things, right? So create, search, list, and search. So back into our view, we have to use what's called a Mixin. You may already be familiar with Mixins. Hopefully you are. If you're not, it's okay. Basically what I need to do is give this blog post API view the ability to create, right? So if I look at it right now, the only ability it has is this get method. So to add in the post method, or any other method for that matter, we can do post request args and keyword args, and then we want to return something here, right? So once I do that, once I create that method and put it into any of our generic views, I refresh in here, it now allows that method. Really, really cool. That saves us a ton of time. Now, that is doing the hard way. That's the hard-coded way that's going to take a lot longer. So we're not going to do it that way. Instead, we're going to use Mixins. And going back into our documentation, we see that Mixins are right here. I click on Mixins, and we can actually import our Mixins, much like we did with our actual generic views. So I'm going to go ahead and do Mixins, and the Mixin I'm going to use is, well, Mixins dot, and we want to use the create model Mixin, right? So Mixins dot create model Mixin. Okay. So I did delete that post method, but we actually need to bring it back in and say self request and then args and keyword args. That post model Mixin has the ability to handle all that. So we do self.create, takes in the request and the args and keyword args. So this method right here is handled by that create model Mixin. Just a quick primer on what's going on down here is you would do something very similar to post. You would do put and patch, and then we would say update. Of course, that is the different Mixin, so I'll let you play around with that if you are really curious about this. If you want to see it in action, check out that whole course. But now that I've got that, I can refresh in here, and I see that I have these new methods, and I scroll down more, I see that I also still have those new methods, but of course, when we update things, we want to be able to actually look up that single item. So we're going to go ahead and remove those. We definitely don't want them there, but that's just generally how this works down here, is it has those methods already written for us, and it already has a way to handle them. So this right here is that built-in method to handle a create call. So if I refresh in here and do some new awesome content, and that's the title, and say whatever for my content and hit post, what do you know? It brings me to the actual created view. It returns that response as it's created. It's a successful call, and so on. I refresh back on this page, and now I've got 5 actual items. So then I could go one step further and go into the actual URL where this thing is located. Really cool, very, very straightforward, very easy. The next thing I want to do is actually handle the search method. Now, there's a lot of different ways on how we can go about doing this, but I'm just going to show you the absolute simplest way, which I think relates a lot of times to your other views, like any general Django view, and that is getting the query from the get method. So if I do self.request.get, and I grab that Q item there, this is where I'm actually doing the search. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out and say initially QS equals to whatever that is, and then I'll say if query is not none, then we'll just query down that thing, that query set itself. We're going to filter it down. So filter, and we'll just do title I contains equals to query. And then we also might want to go even one step further, which this, of course, is just doing more advanced query set related stuff. So from django.db.models, we're going to go ahead and import Q, and I just put Q here, and then I do basically a Q lookup, which gives me this OR ability. So it's going to look for this, or it's going to look for that. So content or title, and then I'll just do distinct to make sure that it's not any duplicates. And then we finally return that query set. That perform create method is still on there. That actually has nothing to do with that. That's more of the list API view. So I refresh in here. Oops, we have a spelling error. So let's make sure that that's request. I refresh in here. Cool. So now I'm going to go ahead and do Q equals to some search. I hit enter. Notice that it returns back a successful call, but there's nothing related to that search. Because it is still a successful call. It didn't have any errors. It just didn't find anything. So in our case, if I wanted to do, post and just search for, oh wait, actually we don't need to put the parentheses in there. We just search for post and it will search finding for those things. If I search for changed, it finds that one. So a very, very basic search. Yes, there are more advanced things. You can definitely check out the documentation for the stuff that they have on there. They also have stuff related to ordering, a lot of really cool little neat features, but the documentation makes it really easy to just try those things out yourself. So going back into our notes, we've now kind of completed this portion of things. But one thing that we're kind of wondering is, well, permissions. Right? How do we actually handle that? Well, we'll talk about that with the Django-jwt related stuff. But by default, what we actually put in here was this session authentication token, right? So something that you may or may not have seen is my user is actually authenticated, and that's how I'm able to get these things going through. Now, if I actually try to go back here, it's going to give me this error. Authentication credentials were not provided. So I wasn't actually logged in. So this brings up the question, is this the best method of how we're going to leave things? When I say that, I mean, should we go back into our default permission classes and leave it as is authenticated? Well, no, I can actually add or read only. And once I do that, I say refresh in here. It doesn't change anything when I am authenticated, but when I go into an incognito window and I'm not authenticated, now I actually get some data. Now, see, this is going to be up to you on how you want that to work. This is also true for any given item, right? So if I go here, notice I have these allowed methods, but I'm not authenticated, so I only can see this one. So if I tried to put or patch or delete, it's not going to let me do that, right? Really, really interesting as far as the permissions are concerned. This is something that's important. Now, what I will say, though, is when you go on your views, you can change those permission classes right on here. So permission classes, and I can quite literally do whatever I'd like here as far as leaving it open. This means that everything is permitted. All permissions are there. So if I opened this up into an incognito window again, I now see that I mean, even in the API console, I can try to make something. But of course, if I try to make something and hit post, I get this error. Now, that has to do with this, right? So that is an error. That is a problem. That's something that you're not going to want to have. So let's go ahead and get rid of it and leave it as is. Okay, cool. So now we've talked about permissions on the sense that, if the user's logged in, they have permission. The next thing is this blog post serializer, right? So update, destroy API view. This is where we might want to have our own custom permission. So if I go into my APIs here, I'll do permissions.py, and I want to create my own custom permission. So right off the bat, I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to go into the documentation and do it. Inside of the documentation, I look for the permissions tab, and I see there's custom permissions here, and this gives me an example. So if I scroll down, I see two examples. One of them is exactly the one that I want, is owner or read only. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing and paste it inside of my permissions part, and I'll just go ahead and do from rest_framework import permissions. Now, you may not know that by intuition, so you would just kind of look and see where it's actually imported. A very easy way to tell is this right here. It says REST framework permissions, And then when we went back into that example, it says permissions dot. So hopefully that's fairly intuitive. Now what we see here is this call right here. It's saying instance must have owner, an attribute named owner. So there's a couple ways around this. I can change this directly, or I can actually go on my model instance itself and just add a property called owner and return self.user. Very simple. You don't have to do that. Like if you weren't wanting to change anything about the model, then you would just come in here and just call this obj.user. That's it. But of course, we don't need to do that. I'm just going to leave it with the example. So this is 100% from the documentation itself. And all of this is just saying, hey, is this like, can we put the method, or is the method that's being requested or used in a safe method? Safe method being a get call, right? Is it getting that data? So that's the read-only portion of this. And this right here is saying, hey, you know, are we making sure that this is the owner of this object? Okay, so now that I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and import this into my view. So from right above serializers, I'll do from.permissions, import the is owner or read-only permission. So now down here, I'm going to say permission classes equals to that one. Now, notice it's classes. It's actually an array, so you can have multiple permissions in there. So we can save that and now refresh in here. So this, what this will do, which we're actually not going to test right now, but what this will do is if we're not authenticated, obviously it only gives us the read-only method. But if we try to do it with a different user than the one that we're working with, then yeah, it's definitely not going to work for us. Okay, so going back into our notes, let's take a look at what we've done so far. We've done this entire thing with the exception of the permissions call and actually getting the JWT related stuff. So we have an API endpoint, we can create, we can list, we can search, we can do retrieve, update, delete. So we can do all of CRUD. Very cool, very easy to do, as you've seen. I know that I'm flying by it, but a lot of this stuff is just fairly intuitive and also not necessarily REST framework specific. The REST framework specific stuff is also very intuitive because it's coming off of Django. It's very much based off of Django and the intuitive nature of Django itself. So I do actually want to create some new things in here, and that is we want to actually run some tests. So I will create a new file called tests.py, and this specifically will be so we can test our API automatically. Yes, there's other ways to test the API, and you should probably implement those other ways. But what we're going to do is literally test the API how we see fit. And if you want a more in-depth look at how we do tests, including, you know, having custom registration and custom authentication, those sorts of things we do in that entire course. That's a much more in-depth, you know, process. So that's out of the context of this video. Unless you guys are super wanting it, let us know in the comments. Otherwise, let's keep going with these tests. So first and foremost, what I'm going to import is the test case. So we'll do from rest_framework.test import API test case. And we'll just go ahead and say class, and this is going to be blog post test case or blog post API test case. And it's going to take in that API test case. So if you're not that familiar with writing unit tests like this, it's fairly straightforward. First of all, you can have a setup method just like this. And yes, that is the syntax. They might have support for underscore. It might be worth a shot on your end. Let us know in the comments if it's working for you. But this is the default setup method. So that means that we can create some things that are related to this test. Now, a couple features about testing is it can be automated, and it's a new kind of like different database. So it's a blank DB. So what that means is we have to actually set up some data in here to make it work. So that data being, we want to create a user object, obviously, and we probably want to create blog posts. Maybe not. Now, in our case, I actually do want to create some blog posts in this setup process because of just the nature of how the setup, like the actual testing portion works. So what I'm going to do is literally create one user and create one blog post, and then we will kind of add to these tests once we start doing the authentication related stuff. So to create our user model, we're going to go ahead and do from django.contrib.auth import get user model, and we're going to set user equals to get user model. This of course is getting us that actual user model, so I can do something like user.objects.create, and I'll say username equals to test CFE user, and we'll give it email equaling to test@test.com. Of course, those things don't actually matter because they will be deleted. And you know, something else that's kind of nice about this is I can get rid of objects and just say user.set, or rather set password, and you know, some rando password that doesn't matter either, and then just do user.save. So that creates our user. Now let's go ahead and create a blog post. So from postings.models import blog post, and we'll go ahead and create this blog post related to this user. So post.objects.create user equals to that user object. So if that's confusing at all, we'll just call this user obj. There we go. And then we'll say title equals new title. And then we'll go ahead and do content equals to some random content. Okay, so now what I want to do is, let's go ahead and separate this out to make it a little bit more Pythonic. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually run a test. So I'll do define test single user, and we'll do self, and we'll do QS user.objects.count, and this is actually user count, and we just want to do self.assert equal, and this is going to be user count is 1. Okay, so we've created a very basic test and we can run it. So inside of my project, I'm just going to go ahead and do python manage.py and test. And it's going to give us one test. And sure enough, everything's good. This is correct. We can do that same thing, test single post, and just change the numbers around a little bit, and or the attributes around a little bit, and do that same thing. Okay, so our setup process is complete as far as this is concerned. But there's a couple things I still need to do to actually test my endpoints. One of them being is wrapping in or connecting with my URLs. Now, you may be familiar with the get absolute URL method in regards to just standard Django views. You know, you would reverse a URL or something like that to get that actual URL. Something I like to define is get API URL, and this is the detail view for that single post in relation to the API. So how do we actually get that? Well, there's a couple ways on how you can do it. You can actually go ahead and do from django.urls import reverse and use reverse to get our URL. Now, a quick reminder on reverse, you get the namespace itself, and you add that in there, add a colon, and then you get the URL name. In our case, it's post.rud, and you put that in there as well, and then we add in keyword args equaling to a dictionary and whatever the URL keyword argument is. In this case, it's pk. So we do pk and we set it equal to self.pk. This is kind of that method that you would use for the get absolute URL method, assuming you were outside of the API. And there's actually nothing wrong with using that method, with the exception that we only get a relative URL. So it's only going to give us something like API postings 1. It's going to be something like that. But we want the fully qualified domain name in there. Otherwise, we want the entire URI, so the entire resource, including the protocol like HTTP or HTTPS, and also the domain name. So to account for that, we can use the REST frameworks version. So from REST framework.reverse import reverse, and I'm going to call it as API underscore reverse. because you might want to use both of these in this actual blog or in this model itself. So I just kind of changed the name of the function or the method to API reverse. So down here, I can use API reverse. And if I really wanted to use that get absolute URL method, I absolutely could. One other thing I will mention is there's something called Django hosts that handles subdomain names. So I would actually say if you have Django hosts, use that one for reverse instead of the REST framework one, because it will give you the actual URL that you desperately need. Okay, so this API URL is useful in a lot of different places. Of course, we're going to use it on our tests, but it's also useful in our serializer. So we can use a field called URL, and we're going to use something called serializers.serializer method field. And this is a useful field for a few reasons, but I'm going to just go ahead and say read only in here as to true. And since I created a field here, I'm going to go ahead and add it in to my actual blog post or the serializer itself. And now that I have this URL, I can probably ignore the primary key. It's kind of up to you on how you want to go about doing that. But before, I was figuring out what the URL was from the primary key, but I want to be very explicit and give it in here. Now, I will say that it's actually the URI. So that's the Uniform Resource Indicator, but we haven't really talked about that. So let's just call it the URL. So now we have this serializer method field, which means that I now have to do something like get, and then whatever that method field name was. In my case, it's URL. So URL, and it takes in self and object, the actual instance itself. So now we can return object.get API URL. Whoa, that was, I mean, hopefully all of that is just like, woof, easy, no big deal, got it. If it's not, hopefully you can go back in the steps. And basically all I did was get this URL method right in this serializer. So now when I look at that blog post and I take a look at in here, I'm actually getting my API blog posts here. So it's giving me the not fully qualified one. So we might have to save our model again. It's possible that I didn't save everything here. So I refresh and wait a minute, the URL is not correct. Now you might intuitively think, hey, it seems like it should work. Well, it actually didn't. So the reason for this has to do with the context. So what I'm going to add in here is request equals to none, and also pass that in as an argument, because that is an actual argument that we can use in here. And since I have this on this method, what I need to do is get it on my serializer here. So how do I actually get the request in here? This is something that's fairly useful. And what I can do is in my view, I can actually add in the request to be sent to my actual serializer method. And to do that, we just go ahead and add in define get serializer context, takes in self, args, and keyword args. And we're going to go ahead and return a dictionary here of request. And all it takes in is self.request. The request is on the view itself. So this is how we can pass it. Since I'm doing it in the RUD view, I'm going to also do it in the regular list view as well. So that serializer definitely has it now. So that means in here, I can say request equals to self.get, or rather self.context.get request. And now I can pass in the request being the request. So since I've got this, save everything, and I refresh in here. And what do I see? Now I have that fully qualified URL. It has everything that I actually needed for that endpoint. So since I've got this, I probably don't need that primary key anymore, like I said, but you might still want to end up keeping it in there, or you might want to call it a different name, and you might want to say ID instead of the primary key. And just to be safe, let's go ahead and make it a read-only field as well. When I say safe, you don't need to do it, but it is something that you might want to get in the habit of thinking through what absolutely should be read-only. Okay, cool. So why do we do all this? A big part of the reason was to test it, to make sure that it's actually working in a way that makes sense. So what I want to do now is actually get any one of these objects. Like I want to do a test to be able to see how to actually, get this data. And I'm going to do it without the user being authenticated first. So what I'm going to do is define test get item. Takes in self, and we want to get that created item that we did up here. So how do we do this? How are we actually going to get this item? Well, first and foremost, we might need data, right? So do we need data in a get call? No, we don't. But I'm going to put it in there because we might need it later. And we do need a URL. So what's the URL? Well, we've already seen this actual URL stuff. Now, I can get the fully qualified URL, or I can get the exact same thing that I did before, which was just the reverse version. So I will actually bring in the REST framework URL call, and I'll come in here and just do that exactly. So what URL is for one single item? What are we going to be getting? Well, before I get any single item, let's just go ahead and do a test get list. So it's just a little bit easier on us initially. So I'm going to call the API reverse that we've seen already. And, well, what's the URL name? It is post create. That's what we've been calling it. So I'll just actually change this to list create. Okay. So we bring that back into our test. That is the URL name, and we called it API posting. And that should give us our actual URL. Again, double checking API postings. Good thing I checked. And this is API postings. So that is what I need to test unauthenticated. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that I can get this response. So I'll just say response equals to self.client. This is built in .get, and we're going to go ahead and get that URL, and we'll set the data, and we'll also add a format as JSON. Like JSON format is the actual request itself. And all we're going to do here is do self.assert equal, and we want the response status code to be something that we may have already seen before. And that should be fairly obvious. That's this right here, HTTP 200 OK. Now, to do that, we're going to go ahead and import from REST framework. We're going to import status. And this is quite literally coming down here, status.http_200 OK. Now, you can absolutely look this up in the documentation to see those things are right, but that's what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and save it, run the test again, and ooh, I get an error, right? So it's giving me this error right here. It's possible I didn't save everything, so let's make sure I do save everything. Saved it again, ran it again, and what do you know? We've got a get call being correct. So that's awesome. What about the actual data itself? Like, we should check the data. Okay, so let's go ahead and just print out the data first. So I'll just go ahead and do print response.data and see what that is. And we run that response data, and here it is. It's an ordered dictionary with, well, how many items or how many things is actually coming back. It looks like it's a few things, but it's not. It's just one item. So this is actually the same sort of content from that one single item that we created right here because of where that URL endpoint is. So we just tested the get list item, okay? And what you will also note, if we try to test the post or test post item, like test a create item, again, we can put in some data here and say title equals to some rando title, and content being some more content. This is roughly the same thing, but instead of get, we would use the post method. Now, what is the status we should expect? Well, I'm going to go ahead and delete that response data call, and as well as there. Well, let's just comment it out. Now I'm going to run the test again, press up, run the test, and I get a failure. Notice this assertion error. 401 does not equal to 200. So this is giving me an invalid request, right? Because I used this post method, so it's actually doing that test for us. Really cool. So what that means is we want to actually say that, hey, this is an HTTP 401 unauthorized, because that's what it is. I run it now, and now they are no longer authorized. Cool. So taking this same idea a couple times, I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste in here. And this time, the URL, I'm going to go ahead and say get item. And I'm going to go ahead and grab that first item for that blog post. So coming down here, we're going to go ahead and do blogpost.objects.first. And in this case, this is, again, the get item. I could just do blogpost.get API URL, right? So we created that instance method, and this will give us that URL now. And all of this related stuff should still be the same. So again, we can print out that response data and then test update item. So now instead of post item, but test update item, we can still actually get that same stuff. So coming in here, in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and change the data, and that's it. So it's changing the data from these things here. Okay, so should we expect the same unauthorized? Yes, but more importantly, this method is also not allowed. So what would this actually be? Would it be unauthorized or something different? I believe it's going to be something different. So I will actually do two tests on this one, and that is the response being this post method being 403, and this is going to be forbidden. And then we'll do put. Forbidden meaning the post call is not allowed on this endpoint. So we run it, and I get two failures. Number one, I get 405, so it's not a forbidden call. So that is the error that it actually is. So what's the 405 error? Going back into the documentation, we look at status codes, and we search for 405. Method not allowed. So it's not a forbidden. It is just simply method not allowed. Will I use forbidden? Well, probably. So I'm going to go ahead and put method not allowed as the call. I'll just paste it in for a moment because we might want to use this forbidden one later. Go ahead and comment that out. So method not allowed is now in here. So we're going to go ahead and save it and run it again. And what do I get? No errors at all. And I actually get that same data back that's coming through as expected. So this data right here is coming back, and it's coming back in a real way. Okay, cool. So we now have all of the tests done, not related to an actual authenticated user, right? So all of this stuff handles that itself. So now what we need to do is actually test the authenticated user, which means that we have to have a way to get a token that will allow us to do said tests. Now, luckily for us, what we can do is we can test this without writing all of the URLs needed for user authentication. So I'm going to do that first. I'm actually going to finish off these tests prior to creating an endpoint for these URLs. So I'll go ahead and do from rest_framework_jwt. Remember, we added that in. .settings. We're going to import our API_settings.jwt_payload_handler. Sorry, we are just importing those settings, but we want to say the JWT payload handler equals to this. So I'm just going to call this JWT, let's just call it payload handler underscore, just like that. And then we'll say JWT or encode handler rather. And that's going to be equal to the API settings dot, and this is the JWT encode handler. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to get that information based off of our user. So scrolling down to the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and copy this one right here, and we're going to paste it in here. I'm still going to use that same blog post, but now what I want to do is get the token that's actually coming from this user. So the user itself is going to be that first user, right? Like we created. So I'll just go ahead and do user obj equals to user.objects.first. Okay. So this is the user I'm using. Now what I want to do is actually say payload equals to the payload handler for that user. And then we want to get the token, and that's, or the token response rather, token response, and that's going to be equal to the encode handler of that payload. And then we want to do self.client.credentials. And we're going to do HTTP underscore authorization, all capitalized. And that is equal to JWT and a space plus that token response. So this is how you set a header for token. So we're using the JWT token header, and that is that REST framework token. So every time I need to do a request that's related to my user, I have to pass in that token. So now what should happen is, well, we should still get this same error, so I don't actually have to test for that anymore. But what I should get with this response is something different. So test update item with user. We save that, and let's go ahead and run it. I get a failed error. It says user is not defined. Oops, I said user obj. Little mistake there. Little save, run it, and we still get an error. What's the error? Well, this is now related to a status code. So that's good. What the status code is should be HTTP and not, you know, the 401 unauthorized, but now HTTP 200 OK. So we actually did the update, which we can see. I can go ahead and do print, let's say, blog post dot content. Let's start off that way. And then after this one, I'm going to go ahead and print out response dot data. Okay, so we should see two different responses here. I'm going to take out any other print statements if I have them. I do not. Save it and run it again. And what do I see? I see some random content. And then a little bit further down, I see some more content. So I successfully updated that item based off of this user. Okay, so I've actually tested that authentication stuff. The one last thing is you can 100% do this same stuff all over again for the create item, this right here. So let's just, really quickly do it. It's not really that challenging here. Hopefully you know, but I'm going to go ahead and just copy these. Paste that in here, and this should do it for me. Okay, so now it should be a created call, like it should actually allow me to create this item, and that is going to be different than 401. Now it's going to be created. I save it and I run it, and what do you know? It's fine. It actually does create it. I'm going to get rid of these print statements here. So what I would encourage you now is test post item with user, we'll call it that. What I would encourage you to do now is to try these out with those different methods. But of course, there is still one last thing that I want to do that is test user credentials or test user ownership. This is more or less the last thing that I would want to do, and that's this right here. So what I need to do is create a new user, and I'll just say username equals to test user 2 or whatever. That's what I'm going to leave it as, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a new object with that test user. So create a new object with that new user object, and then we'll say that's the owner user, so we'll just call this owner. Okay, but that's still the object that I'm going to try and update. So I'll change this to being put. And this should be actually the put call. Little mistake as far as the data is concerned. I'm going to go ahead and copy these and bring it down here. Okay, so we've got our token that we still want, and that's going to be based off of that original user. So user obj equals to user.objects.first. Still that same user. Okay, but now just a different blog post. And we've got our URL, we've got our title. This user, these related things I no longer need because I've set those credentials. And then now I'm going to go ahead and try and put this data to this other blog post, right? So this is a different user creating a different blog post. This is our first user, our original user. And we could also do self.assert, instead of assert equal, assert not equal. And that will be user obj dot username and owner dot username. That's going to test whether or not they are not equal, basically. And then it's going to create that payload for the other user, and it's going to give us that authorization. And then finally, it's going to try and update it with some new content, and I should get a forbidden call here. So we save that and we run it. What do you know? We get successful call. Very cool. And a lot of this stuff is just playing around with it, learning more about tests in general. But this is how you can actually run automated API tests. And it's something that you really need to do because you can't actually test it in any other real way, in a very good way, at least. This I thought was a pretty good way of actually going through and testing out this API itself. But we are still not done. So what I want to do is actually go to the jwt documentation, and I'm going to just give you a quick little rundown of what we just did that's already on that jwt documentation. And when I say it is this import right here, all of that is coming from their documentation. So creating a new token manually, that's this right here. That's what I literally just did, is create a manual new token. So you can do this anywhere then. And that means any custom API view or any custom view you have, you can absolutely use that same method to actually send back a token with that user object anywhere. It doesn't need the request at all. It just needs the user object, and it can actually create that token. And then you just add that HTTP header for authorization. So the authorization header, you would add this in there itself. So if you were using something like Python requests, you would do requests dot like post and the URL, the data, and then you would say like headers equals to and authorization, and then you would put it jwt plus whatever that token is, right? So that's essentially how you would do it. And this is true on any sort of HTTP library doing the HTTP calls themselves. Okay, so that's that part, but how do we actually get that token on our API anyway? Well, we can go to usage and we see this right here. So this is obtaining the jwt API token. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and we will come back into our project, into our URLs, our main project URLs, and we're just going to add this in here. So I'm going to cut and paste and do a lot of things kind of quickly, and I'm going to go ahead and add a URL name to this, and I'll call this API login, because that's essentially what it is. So instead of using their URL endpoint, I'll just do API auth and login. Put a $ at the very end of that, and there's our new URL for API login. How do we test this? Hopefully you have some idea. We have API reverse here, so I'm just going to go ahead and come down to the very bottom and do define test user login self, and what's the data going to be? Well, it's going to be the username, and the username in this case is our test CFE user. So we'll do that. And then our password, and what's the password that we set in this test call? Some rando password. We set that in there. And then the URL itself is API reversed, and we called it API-login, right? So just the URL name, because we don't have a namespace for it. So back into that test. And then we're going to go ahead and do a post call. So we'll do self dot, and this would be client dot post, and it's going to be URL and data. And that, of course, is the response itself. And we're going to go ahead and print out the response dot data. And then finally, I'll go ahead and print out the status code being okay. So I'll just assert that's equal, just like that. Okay, so testing user login. Let's try it out. I'm going to run it, and I get a failed error. Oops. Make sure I put a comma here. Run that again. And what do you know? It actually worked. Now, why did this work? Why did this actually give me back a status code of okay? Well, it has everything. All of these things have everything to do with this setup. If you don't do this setup correctly, you will fail. Things will fall apart. Now, the big question to you should be, should this test user login be on your tests for posts? No, it should be in a different place, but I'm doing it so you guys can see it in action and actually be able to work with it. Now, one other thing is I printed out that request data, and here is a token. So I see that I can do token equals to response.data.get token. And we'll say if token is not none, then, well, let's go ahead and verify this ownership. Actually, sorry, not verify the ownership, but test the updating of this item like we did up here. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab it and bring it back down here. And this is where something like this would actually make sense. So test user login and update, which again, we didn't actually have to do this payload handler and all this stuff any longer because we actually did the login in a different way, right? So I just wanted to show you those two different ways on how it can be done because it's still fairly important. So that blog post, I still need that one. That's correct. I've got data. That's good. I have a new user object, which I no longer need. I don't have to worry about the user object. Instead, I have to worry about that token. So I'm going to just change this token RSP to just that token, get rid of these things right here, those 3 lines. And now I should get exactly the same response. So if the token is none, then I'm just not even going to run a test. There's probably something else that's going on here that would probably be caught in another test. So for sure, this token should come back. Again, if the URL is incorrect, then it won't come back and an error will be raised and you'll have to diagnose it. So I press up, I run it, boom, we've got it. It's working. Everything's working as expected and as we needed. So what's left? What do you still need to do? Well, what you need to do is actually create an endpoint for registration. Like we didn't actually do that. All we did was create a REST API stuff so you can log in. Now, in some cases, you would have an API for registering. In other cases, you won't. It's kind of up to you on how you're going to actually handle the registration process. So that's a really good challenge to leave you with. Now, we absolutely do that in that REST API course on joincfe.com/courses/REST API. We definitely do the registration there. So you can see that, but I definitely gave you enough here to be able to do the register API call if you know enough about Django. So if you know how to do a custom register API view in Django, you can absolutely do it now that you have a better understanding of building your own REST API. So that's one challenge. Another challenge would be do this with more than one app. And yes, write these unit tests. Absolutely, absolutely write these unit tests. You can use this one as example if you need to. Now, I see that mine has a lot of things going on with it, but it's testing various aspects of the API to ensure that they're working correctly. So before I ever go live or I ever even consider saying that that portion is done, I'm going to want to run this test to make sure, and it's automatically going to happen. Now, of course, if you haven't used unit tests before, do note that every method that has test underscore whatever, that will actually run the test. It will, if you have test in the name of the function at the beginning, just like this, it will run a test. Same is true for the actual module itself. If it's called tests.py or tests underscore something else, it will run those tests as well. So yeah, you want to make sure you follow these naming conventions. And of course, I wouldn't show you it the wrong way without explaining that I showed you it the wrong way. Now, can these things be cleaned up? Probably. You could probably write these tests a little bit differently. I wrote them in this way to test those various aspects that we already mentioned. And now what you can also do as a third and final challenge is to actually build an API client, probably using Python requests. If you're not familiar with Python requests, there's a lot of things that we do on it. Definitely our web scraping related stuff, as well as 30 days of Python. We cover that. We also cover building that same client in that bigger course. And if you've caught up with me this far, you'll know that this is covering a lot of things. We did it super fast, but there's still so much more that we could have done to really clarify and understand these things on a much deeper level. Thus, the reason for you to just join that other course. But for those of you who aren't ready to do that yet, this hopefully was a really good primer in the REST API related stuff. Now, I will say I do have another video for creating a blog API. It's called, I believe it's called the blog API, actually. That one it goes a little bit slower, but it doesn't cover as much as this one does. We actually, refined that content over time based off of questions we've received, and also the sheer demand for having a better way to test the API, because this is the right way to do it. This is the Django way. This is the developer way, is to write actual unit tests based off of it. Now, something else that we didn't talk about were authentication classes, right? So in the settings itself, we had these 3 different authentication classes, and those were done by default. So what I would actually do at the end of the day is probably only have the JSON Web Token authentication if all you're doing is a REST API. If you have a normal Django web application with Django views and all that, then yeah, sure, you would probably use the session authentication. But that's something that I also did not cover because, well, it's fairly straightforward on how it works. The permissions is a little bit more important than exactly how the authentication classes work. Obviously, authentication is more important than permission, but in the case of what we did here, this is just a very good way of handling this. And hopefully now you actually fully appreciate how thought out the Django REST framework was. I mean, it looks so much like regular Django views and Django forms. It just is like just a joy to use once you start getting used to using it. And you might have to watch this video a couple more times to really fully grasp all of it. And yeah, so that's it. That's it for this one. If you have questions, comments, concerns other than the fact that it was so fast, I absolutely know it was so fast. There's just so much to cover that I wasn't going to make this a 3+ hour content video. Instead, that's where that course is. The course goes a little bit slower and it talks about these things in more depth. But for many of you, you might just want to watch this and not even code it, but see how it's all done and then go and try and do it with the video. That's just something that I've heard works really well. And again, also the other more particular reason as to why it was so fast is because this is not for beginners. New beginners that are jumping into this, I applaud you for getting this far if you did, and if you followed along, that's awesome. I'm like really proud of you for doing that. But it wasn't made for beginners. It's made for you more advanced Django users that have probably mastered a lot of the things related to building a Django project without an API or a REST API. So thanks so much for watching. I'm super excited to do more REST API stuff. So if you do have like suggestions for more REST API related things and just related to the API, not any other third-party library like Vue or some sort of JavaScript client or whatever. Let's not hear about those things just yet. Let's hear more about the REST API stuff and what you want to see done there, even like if it's another authentication package, for example. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one.